Hello everyone, welcome to the Linode Linux Server Security series. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at SSH brute force protection with Fail2ban. Now, this video is going to be building up upon the YouTube series, or the series that was a prelude to this series that is available on our YouTube channel on HackerSploit. You can find that by visiting youtube.com/HackerSploit, and you'll be able to find the series. And it's recommended that you watch that series before you move into this series, as it builds upon each other, or they build upon one another. So within the first series, we talked about the essentials of SSH security. We took a look at how to set up SSH securely from the ground up, the various configurations available, how to set up key-based authentication, so on and so forth. Now, this particular playlist on Linode, or on 24, will actually cover a more security-centric topics regarding Linux. And will involve me showing you how to A, secure your server, B, I'll show you how attackers actually perform the attack so that you have a better understanding of what's going on in the background, and lastly, I'll tell you how to audit your server, to actually test your server yourself to see if the security changes and the security features and protocols you're putting in place are actually protecting your server adequately. So when we talk about brute forcing and brute force attacks, let me just briefly explain that if you're not aware or you're not familiar with these types of attacks. So brute force attack is very simple. It's similar to what you would have if you're trying to pick a lock on a safe. All you're trying to do is listen for particular clicks, right? So a brute force attack is similar to that. However, it's usually targeted in the context of computers and the internet. It usually targets authentication systems with username and password combinations. So again, if you have an authentication protocol like SSH that utilizes the username and password combination to actually give someone access, the brute force attacks is an automated attack by an attacker where he sends a plethora or a ton of requests to the server with random username and passwords in the hope of magically, or in the hope of finding the correct username and password. So it's just through multiple attempts with various lists of username and passwords. Now, of course, when it comes down to brute force attacks and highly structured brute force attacks, attackers will usually target the most privileged accounts on the system. One of these accounts is going to be the root account. So they'll typically use the root username, and then for the passwords, they'll have what you call a word list that will contain a random amount of passwords that was leaked on the internet from websites and databases. And these are common passwords that one might use, and they would again use this with automated tools like Hydra to perform these brute force attacks on servers. And again, through sheer luck or persistence, they're able to find a correct combination. Now, of course, these attacks, as you can already tell, rely on certain variables. One of these variables is going to be number one, are you using accounts that are that have the most privileges, like the root account? Number two, are your passwords secure enough? When I say are they secure enough, are they more than 8 characters long? Do they feature uppercase and lowercase characters? Do they feature numbers and symbols, so on and so forth? So that's your initial step, but what we are doing in this video is we are trying to remedy that problem, or we're trying to mitigate these attacks. Now that we have that out of the way, we can actually move on to what Fail2ban is. Now, Fail2ban is an intrusion prevention framework that's written in Python, and what it does, it essentially protects Linux systems and servers from brute force attacks on any protocol that has a username and password combination. So SSH, FTP, Telnet, so on and so forth. And of course, Fail2ban is set up in such a way that it actually does this actively. So it's actively monitoring your traffic, or the traffic incoming to that particular port, and it's actively mitigating these attacks based on the parameters that you set. So as I said, brute force attacks can be extremely powerful and may result in thousands or even hundreds of thousands of failed authentication attempts per day. And it is therefore vital to understand how to protect the server from these attacks and how to block IP addresses of attackers. So again, if you're getting attacked from a particular IP address or from a particular group of attackers, it's very important to know how to block these IP addresses so that you reduce the attack surface. That being said, blocking IP addresses can be done manually, as you've seen in the previous video or the previous series on YouTube, where I actually showed you how to set up a firewall with UFW and how to block IP addresses manually. But that becomes extremely cumbersome when you need to block 100 or 1,000 IP addresses and you want to do that automatically. So Fail2ban automates the process of blocking IP addresses dynamically and in real time based on the current threat level or your attack surface. So we can actually get started now. The first thing I'm going to do now is I'm going to open up a Linode, and we want to create a new server. And I'm just going to show you how to set it up from scratch. And we're going to create Linode, and I'll just set it up with Ubuntu 20.04. There we are. And the region, I'll just use Atlanta. And for the Linode plan, we'll go for the Nanode 1 GB 1 CPU. That's perfectly fine. And I'll just call this Fail2ban. And we'll enter a password. Of course, I'll enter a secure password as possible. There we go. And yeah, we can hit create, and that's going to create the Linode for us. So I'm just going to wait for this to actually provision and create and initialize the instance for us. And then we can actually get started with installing Fail2ban, configuring Fail2ban, and then I'll show you how to simulate these attacks and how to protect them actively with Fail2ban. All right, so the Linode has been created and it's now running. So we can just copy the IP address right over here, and we can say SSH and SSH root, and we just paste in the IP there, and we'll log in directly. So it looks like I have an issue with my SSH key. So I'll just get rid of my known keys here. 1 second. That is under SSH, and known keys or known host. I'll just get rid of these as I don't require them anyway. And then I'll try to log in one more time. And there we are. It's going to add it to my known hosts, and I'll put in the password I specified earlier. And we'll wait for that to authenticate. And there we are. Right. So let's get started with installing Fail2ban. So to install Fail2ban, it comes, Fail2ban is a package that comes, usually is available with the default repositories on Debian or on Ubuntu, on Red Hat, so on and so forth. So you can find it by typing in sudo apt install and Fail2ban. Right, and we hit enter. That's going to begin installing Fail2ban. Now, as I said, Fail2ban, like a firewall, is a service, and that means when you're working on Linux, you need to ensure that if you have this running or you want this running constantly, you need to ensure that it's started on system startup. So even if you reboot your server, it'll actually start up when your system reboots, and you don't have to worry about starting it up manually. To do this, we want to say system control enable fail2ban.service. Hit enter. It's going to enable that on startup, and then we want to start the service. But before we do that, we actually need to understand a few things. So firstly, the default directory for Fail2ban. So you can find the default directory and configuration files for Fail2ban within the etc directory as you would, and under Fail2ban. So again, within this, you have all your Fail2ban configuration files, and we'll get to that in a second. But there's a few things I need to explain before we do that. Number one, what is your actual or your current SSH configuration? So if we say vim etc ssh and sshd config, the configuration option we're looking for here is going to be, let me just scroll to the bottom. We are looking for the actual authentication attempts, and I believe that should be somewhere right over here, if I'm not wrong. Let me just see if I can find it. This is with OpenSSH. It should be right here somewhere. There we are. I think it's right over here. Right. So in terms of authentication, you can see that the max authentication attempts are set to 6. What this means is that if you try and authenticate to this server via SSH and I provide invalid credentials or wrong credentials, it'll give me a maximum of 6 attempts before it tells me, hey, yeah, you're not providing us with anything useful, so I'm going to terminate your connection. So this is very important to know. You can change this to whatever you want, because with Fail2ban, you're also going to specify your own authentication attempt option, which will tie into this very closely. I'll get to that in a second. So what I'll do is I'll write and quit, and we can now get into the juicy stuff. So we'll want to go into the etc Fail2ban directory, and within this, you have what you call your jail.conf file. Now, when we talk about jails in relation to Fail2ban and security, jails are security configurations for a particular service or port on the system. For example, we can have an SSH jail, and the SSH jail is responsible for protecting the SSH service from brute force attacks. We can also have an FTP jail, and the FTP jail is responsible for protecting and ensuring that the FTP service is kept secure from brute force attacks. So that's what a jail is, just so that is clear enough. Right, okay, so that's what a jail is, and as I said, their purpose is simply to protect a particular service. And within these jail files, we'll be adding our security configuration. So it's very, very simple to understand. Now, when we talk about how Fail2ban works exactly, is it actually reads the authentication log within Linux, and through that authentication log, it automatically comes to a conclusion as to what it needs to do. For example, if I list out the authentication log, so if I say, let's say I want to cat the contents of var and log on Ubuntu and Debian, it's the log files are stored within the log directory under var, and we're looking for auth and auth.log, and we can grep this for the service. We can say we're looking for SSHD. So SSHD refers to SSH authentication attempts, and we can hit enter. And you can see that these are all the logs within the auth.log file, and it's you can see it's sorted out in terms of the time, right? So chronologically or sequentially. So September 26th, 21:36:30, we have the server is listening on port 22, server is listening on port 22 again, and then the connection is closed, and there is an accepted password right over here, so authentication is established to my IP for the user root. So Fail2ban uses these logs to come to a conclusion as to whether or not it should block an IP address, when it should block it, for how long it should block it. So if it sees some failed authentication requests here, it's going to say, hey, are those failed authentication attempts more than 3? Are they more than 5? All right, if they're more than 5, block this IP address for a certain amount of time, prevent it from connecting to the server via SSH. So that's what Fail2ban does. It does the purpose, or it actually simplifies the process of, it actually, what it does, it automates the process of banning IP addresses, similar to what a firewall would do, but it automates this entire process. So going back into the Fail2ban directory, within here we have our default jail.conf file. If we display the jail.conf file, jail.conf, you can see that we can actually just go right to the top here, and this will have the default jails that are available to you, and it contains various services that you can protect using Fail2ban. And if I can just use a utility here, like I'll just say less, and we'll say jail.conf, and I'll just display that to you. So you can see that within the jail file, it tells you right over here, you should not modify this file. It'll probably be overwritten or improved in a distribution update. And that's true. We're not going to use this file. We're going to create our own, which is recommended. But again, you can see in regards to creating a jail for SSHD, you just specify SSHD right over here and set the options, and it's fairly simple to do. So we are going to be creating our own jail.local file. Now the jail.local file is where we specify our own jails. In this case, we're only securing SSH, so we'll say vim, and within this directory we just say jail.local. The reason we're not using the jail.conf file is because that file will be overwritten or if we update Fail2ban, and it's not recommended that we do that. It's recommended that we create our own configuration, which is again something that I recommend doing. Right, so within this file is where we start creating our jails. We can create more than one jail for whatever service we're trying to protect. So in regards to SSH, creating our jail is fairly simple. We specify the service. In this case, it's the SSH daemon, and we specify a jail by including it in brackets. So below that, we specify the options. Number one, we say enabled. We want to set the enabled option to true. We then want to set the port to SSH, right? So we'll set the port to SSH, and then we want to set the filter. And when we say the filter, that is the keyword that is going to look for within the auth.log file. Remember, we used the grep utility and we looked for the SSHD pattern or the expression. We need to specify that expression here. So SSHD, that's what it's going to look for. And then we specify the log path. So it's going to say, hey, all right, you want me to look for SSHD authentication attempts. Tell me the auth file you want me to look for this expression within. And we're going to say var log auth.log. And that's the file we're going to use, because the auth.log file lists out all the authentication attempts, regardless of whether they are local or remote. We then have the max retry option. Now, the max retry option is the amount of retries you get in the event you enter a incorrect password. In the case of attackers, they are going to have more than one failed attempt. So the max retries we can set to something like 3. That is recommended for fairly good security. So if you don't enter the correct password within 3 attempts, you're out. We then have the find time. So find time. The find time we can specify, and the time denotation is listed in the form of seconds. So when we talk about find time, this is the amount of time between failed attempts, and again, you can customize that whatever you feel is appropriate. I think 300 seconds is good enough. We then have the ban time. The ban time is self-explanatory. This is the amount of time you want to ban that IP from making another authentication request. And you can set this to whatever time you want: 1 year, 1 week, 2 days, 24 hours, 6 hours, so on and so forth. And of course, given that it's in seconds, I can specify 1 hour, so 3600. There we are. And that's the ban time. And then that's pretty much it. So this is your SSHD jail, or your SSH security jail, and this is what it's going to do. Is it's going to protect SSH from brute force attacks. And I'll just take you through the options one more time. So number 1, the status can be changed to true or false based on whether you want to enable it or disable it. The port we've said is SSH. The filter is going to be SSHD, and that is the expression that Fail2ban is going to look for within the var log auth.log file, and the max retries you get is 3. The find time, or the amount of time between failed requests, is going to be 300 seconds, and the ban time is going to be 3600 seconds. So excellent, we can now move on. So we want to save this file, right? And we can now start the Fail2ban service. So we say system control ctl start Fail2ban, and we say service here, Fail2ban.service, and hit enter, and that's going to start it. We can then check out the status here. So we say Fail2ban status, and we can see it's active and running. All right, excellent. So you might be saying, is that it? Have we set up brute force protection for SSH with Fail2ban? And the answer is yes. All right, so to actually test and see if this is working, we can log out, and I'll do that right now. So that's going to log me out, and I can actually try and block myself out of the server by, of course, entering the incorrect attempts, so on and so forth. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to enter some incorrect passwords, and let's see what happens. So I'm just going to say SSH root, and it's going to ask me to enter password. I'll just enter some incorrect passwords here. So 1, 2, 3, there we are. Hit enter, permission denied, please try again. It should give me my attempts here. So there we are. Enter it one more time. It's going to tell me those are the standard. There we are, permission denied, public key password. So let's go one more time. And that's because we had set the attempts to 6 within the OpenSSH configuration file. So I'll just hit enter. That should tell me again, and then we should be able to go for the 6th or the 7th time. It's when it should actually ban me. So I'll try it. There we are. This should be the last attempt we have. I'll enter an incorrect password here, and there we are. Hit enter one more time. And it looks like Fail2ban has come and stopped the connection between us and the server, and the SSH port rather. And this was after, I believe, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 attempts. And the reason it did this was because, as I mentioned earlier on, within the OpenSSH configuration file, the amount of attempts was set to 6, right? And Fail2ban will actually use that. So that's very important. And then, of course, within its own configuration, you can then customize it how you want. So in this case, you can see that it's not giving us any response here. And if I just hit Control-C and I try and log in again, it's going to tell us SSH connect to the host IP. It gives us the IP and the port, and it tells us connection refused. So regardless of whether I have the correct credentials, I can't make contact with this server because my IP is blocked and Fail2ban is actively blocking it, right? So if I try that again, not working, try it again, just does not work, and my IP address will be banned for the ban time that we specified. In my case, the ban time was set to 1 hour, I believe. So yeah, so I'm essentially blocked out of my own SSH server, and the only way to get access or to get back access is to use the Linode console. So I'm just going to launch it, and I'll just try and expand that, and let's see if I can increase my font size. I'm just zooming in at this point. Right, so hopefully you can see this. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to stop the service so I can log back in. And what we can actually do is also unban my IP. I can actually show you how to unban IPs with Fail2ban, because it can be very useful. And one of the useful features that we have with Linode here is the fact that we get a console that we can actually access. So I can actually unban we can unban my IP. So I'll say Fail2ban client, and we'll get to monitoring the failed authentication attempts, or I can actually show you that right now. So to view the failed authentication attempts for a particular jail, we use the Fail2ban client. If I hit enter, it gives us various options regarding the Fail2ban service, and we can view all of that. However, in my case, what I want to do is we just say clear, and I'll just just scroll to the top here. What I can say is Fail2ban client status, and then I specify the name of the jail. In our case, the jail is SSHD. Hit enter. It's going to tell us right over here the filter currently failed, total failed, and the file list in question, and then it tells us the actions that were performed. In this case, the actions were currently a band is set to 1, total band is set to 3, and the banned IP list is, it'll give us a list of those IPs here. In my case, it gives us my local IP, so I'll need this when I'm unbanning it. So if I want to unban myself with Fail2ban, I can say Fail2ban client, and then I say set the name of the jail, SSHD, and then I say unban IP, and I put in the IP address that I want to unban, and I hit enter, and it's going to tell me it's unbanned 1 IP here. And if I say Fail2ban client status SSHD and hit enter, you can now see the banned IP list is set to nothing. So that means I can now get access to SSH or via SSH using my local IP again. So I just need to specify the password, and I now have access. There we are. Fantastic. So you can actually now see the power of a service like Fail2ban, and typically attackers will automate this process and will not do it manually as I did. So when you talk about the attackers, an attacker will typically use a tool like Hydra. So I'll just go to my desktop here, and I'll just create a password list or a word list that contains, just some random passwords or passwords that were leaked from databases online that contain commonly used passwords. So I can say vim, and I'll just call this word list.txt, right? And within this, I can enter in some random passwords like password 123, pass 123. And I can then say something like, just something weird like April 1972, just random things people would usually enter. We can say December, let's see, we can enter John 1234, password, 678. Let's enter just a few more here so that we have enough to actually demonstrate the test. We can then just say, I like donuts, which I don't actually, and then we say burgers, and just random stuff. Of course, in the real world, an attacker would use a much more refined list of passwords that actually users did use, and I'll just say word pass, right? And I save this, and this is the word list. They would typically use a tool like Hydra. Hydra is a brute forcing tool. So if I just open up Hydra here, you can see, just minimize that or just lower my font. Hydra is a brute forcing tool that can be used to brute force various services like SSH, FTP. So to use it, they would say SSH or Hydra, and they specify the username, which in this case will be root. They'll be targeting the root account, and then the user or the password list, which is capital P, and then they specify the directory to that particular word list. So desktop wordlist.txt, and then they specify the protocol, which is SSH, and then they put in the IP here. So let me just open up this here and copy the IP, just zoom out, and we can then put that in here. And you can also specify the port, but by default Hydra will use port 22. I hit enter, it's going to say attacking SSH, and we can actually enable verbosity. So I'll just use the capital V here, and I will hit enter, and we'll just wait for that to begin, because this is we actually have a previous session, so it's going to overwrite that. So we'll just wait for this to begin. It's going to take about 10 seconds. There we are, attacking, and it's going to test out all the username and passwords, and you can see 0 valid passwords found. And we can try that one more time, and you see sometime during this particular brute force attack, it is actually going to block our IP address, and if we try and perform the attack again, it's going to give us the same error we got when we try to log in via SSH manually. It tells us connection refused. The attacker will then try the attack again, hit enter, connection refused, try it again, hit enter, refused, so on and so forth. So what I can do now, if I go back into my console here, my Linode console, and we actually list the status, so Fail2ban client, and we say status SSHD, hit enter, you can now see it tells us the total failed attempts is 13, the total banned is 4, and the currently banned IP is set right over here. So it bans us again. And that's typically how attackers would orchestrate these attacks using tools like Hydra. Now, of course, they are more likely to use much more sophisticated word lists. For example, they typically use the RockU word list. So just open this up. So RockU word list, open that up here, and they would typically use the common password list called rocku.txt, and this is an extremely large file that contains all of these passwords right over here, and you can scroll through it. So again, these are all passwords that have been leaked. As you can see, rocku.txt contains 14,341,564 unique passwords used in 32,603,388 accounts. So it's extremely powerful, and again, I recommend not using passwords that are this simple, and again, to either use key-based authentication, or if you end up using passwords anyway, Fail2ban is a great way of protecting your server. And as I've shown you, it allows you to monitor the current attack surface and how many attacks you're receiving per day, so that you actually know when your server is being attacked, how you can mitigate these attacks, and it helps you build a profile of the actual amount of attacks you're actually experiencing every month, week, day, so on and so forth. That being said, that's going to be it for this video, and I'll be seeing you in the next video when we'll be getting started with IP tables.